I should say another one. We're going to talk again about a big topic that we started about last week, talking about sin. When we talk about Genesis, we are talking about beginnings. That's what the word means. We're talking about the origin of mankind. We're talking about the origin of the earth and the world and all these things. But we're also talking about the origin or the beginning of relationships, the beginning of relationships with man and God, with man and each other. And so all these things kind of come into now this practical sense of it's not just God said this. This is now we see what happens when you follow what God said. We see what happens when you don't follow what God says. And that's part of the conversation, at least for us tonight. So tonight we're going to talk about the reality of sin. And we're going to look at dominion and servitude as well. But we're going to just start by reading this story. Genesis chapter 4, if you want to join me there. I would trust that this is a story that is at least somewhat, if not completely familiar with us. The story of Cain and Abel. When we think of these two brothers, obviously this is not a wholesome event. This is a tragic event. But it does share a whole lot that we need to know about the nature and reality of sin. So start with me. We'll read the first 15 verses. This main part of the story, we're going to leave off what happens after that portion probably tonight. But verse 1, Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I've acquired a man from the Lord. And then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. And now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. Now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. And then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What have you done? And the voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. And when you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth. And Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Surely you have driven me out of this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth. And it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me. And the Lord said to him, Therefore whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him. There's a lot in this story. There's absolutely a lot in this story. I want to make just a preliminary comment. I think we've started to make this before about some of these stories. These are stories that we have talked about down with the littles. And what ends up happening sometimes is we talk about the stories, but we get them down there at the level of the littles. Sometimes we leave them there. And they become second nature. We just kind of look over them, pass over, I know that story, and so forth. This is one of the most profound stories in all of Scripture on the reality of sin. And it comes right here at the beginning of this book, not by accident by any means, but by purpose. And it is so important for us as we're looking at Cain and Abel from this chapter to ask some important questions. So instead of waiting at the end, we're going to start tonight. What is sin? We asked that question ending last week. So if I were to ask you, what is sin, how would you define it?
Disobedience to God.
Okay, disobedience to God. Not necessarily looking for a particular answer. I'm just wanting us to see what comes to our mind when we think of sin.
I've always heard it means missing the mark.
Okay, that's the technical definition of the word, is to miss the mark.
Anything that comes between you and God.
Okay, the things that separate us from God or comes between us. We talked about it last week, right? It's not just the missing of the mark, but it's the fracturing of relationship. It's fracturing the trust. It brings in death. I mean, all these things are associated with sin, but I think sometimes sin still is this thing we know, but we can't really describe and define. We just know it's wrong, right? So in this story, though, sin takes a couple different characteristics that are really important for us to see, and that's what we're going to kind of start off our conversation with from this. So sin, as Alan just mentioned, technically is missing the mark. So if we were to do a technical definition of the word in Greek or the word even in Hebrew that's underneath this, that's what it means. It's to miss the mark. So if you're talking about law, missing the mark. If you're talking about what God's expectations are, missing the mark, it becomes sin. We know in the book of James that James says to know to do right and to do it not, to him it's sin. Again, you're missing the mark. You know where the mark's supposed to be. You know what you're supposed to do, but you're missing it. So technically it works, and that's fine, and that's good. But sometimes technical definitions don't help us to live them out. And what I mean by that is, what do we do with this concept of sin in our world, in our own lives? We need to see it for what it really is underneath. And again, I think the story really helps us.
I've heard people say, well, it doesn't say that you can't do that. Like, it literally doesn't say something wrong sometimes. It's not in the Bible verse, but you have to make application sometimes.
Yeah.
And
if it doesn't have the direct statement, like the kid that said, you didn't say I couldn't.
Right.
Yeah. So again, even the technical term won't allow for that because, again, we know what the right mark is, and you're still missing it by that. So, I use this as a law of exclusion. We really struggle in spiritual realms with this, but we do it all the time. When you pull up to the drive-thru, I know we've all done that at some point and ordered food. They have a menu, right? So when you order, how do you order? Whatever your favorite, terrible food for you place is. You hit McDonald's, you hit KFC, Taco Bell, whatever it is. How do you order? This is a really simple question. I'm not trying to trick you. Promise.
Whatever number combo you want.
But do you have a favorite?
Is around 80.
Okay. Well, somebody's got to jump in and tell me their favorite. All right. So I'm going to go to McDonald's. I don't really like McDonald's. I'm going to order me a quarter pounder, and I can't remember what number it is. But I'm going to look for that on the thing because I'm going to look for the little picture so I can do as little brain power as I can and have to read and say, I want a number or whatever. You know what I don't do? I don't tell whoever is on the other side of that little microphone, I want a number 10. I do not want a number 1. I do not want a number 2. I do not want a number 3. I don't want the extra fries. I don't want it large size. I don't want a side of bacon. I don't want cookies or whatever. I don't go through the whole menu and tell them what I don't want. Why?
If you wanted the whole menu, you'd say it one. If not, you just say it one.
Yeah. It would be hilarious if I did. And I'm not past doing that. But that's not how we act. Okay, so when I was in high school, I was on the academic team, and we stopped at a Burger King, of all places. And I don't know why I did this, but we're coming out of the restaurant, does that really apply? All right, we're coming out of the fast food place, and, we had to get to the bus, which was in the back, and you had to pass the drive-thru. So I just walked up into the drive-thru, and they came over the thing. Can I help you? And I said, no, just browsing. And then walked away. But anyway, you didn't need to know that. Just while I share it. And I lost my train of thought by doing that. All right. So the point of not having to tell them everything you don't want is part of how we communicate. It's the natural law of exclusion. I'm going to tell you what I want. That excludes what?
You don't want.
Everything else. Right? So if your spouse says, hey, what do you want for supper? Now you might say, well, I really don't feel like this, and that might be part of it. But you're not going to go through every possibility there is. You're usually going to end up saying, well, Italian sounds good, or Mexican sounds good, or whatever. When we talk about missing the mark, what did God say? What did he say about behavior? What did he say about these things? That excludes other behaviors that are at least in the same category, right? We can develop that more on another occasion. But anyway, going back to our original technical term here, this is missing the mark. But I want us to look back at the story. There's this anthropomorphism. I can't ever say that. This idea of taking a concept and kind of giving it, well, either human or animal-like characteristics, and you see that with sin. And I want to go back and look at this as we have these two sacrifices, and what characterized the sacrifices themselves? What were they?
Giving something or
Yeah.
offering something to the Lord.
Yeah, where did it come from?
From the earth.
Well, one did.
And the other, I mean, one was an animal, one was a vegetable or grain.
Yeah, but they gave from what they were involved in, right?
Yeah, what they grew.
Yeah, Cain was a farmer, and he was growing his produce and so forth. And Abel was a shepherd, and he was raising flocks, and they gave of that. Did God ask for something specific? Don't know. It doesn't say, does it? A matter of fact, the only other help we get on that passage is the Hebrew writer said that Abel offered his by faith. And Cain obviously did not. Now, we can develop that. That's why I said there's a lot in that. So what does that mean? Did Cain believe that God was God?
Sure.
Well, yes. But he didn't offer it by faith. So it's more than belief here. It's more than, well, he didn't just do something because he did something. He didn't thumb his nose at God and say, I'm not going to give you anything. But God respected Abel's and he did not respect Cain's. Now, I can do some conjecture and say, you know what, well, Abel must have gave of his best, and Cain must have not given him his best. But that's just conjecture. I don't know. All I know is that he didn't do it by faith. Okay? But God intervenes, and that's really, really important for us to see. It's not like he just left them to figure this out. In verse 6, the Lord said to Cain, is that in a vision? Is that in a dream? Is that, he appeared to him and started talking? I don't know. It doesn't tell us. All I know is that the Lord talked to Cain. Okay? And what does he say?
Why are you angry?
Why are you angry? Why has your countenance fallen? In other words, why is your disposition fallen? You're not joyful, you're not happy, you're sorrow, you're grieving, you're angry. I want to see, look at verse 7. This is the key, probably to the whole passage, at least in my summation, especially for none. He says, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And then what does he say? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. What did the Lord in that conversation do with this concept of sin?
Like you said, gave it like a predator, like.
Yeah, if you need some help, there's some note up there. Yeah.
Yeah.
It kind of that almost like cat kind of picture, isn't it? Just lying in wait, waiting to pounce. We think of a lion or something on the Serengeti, like in the weeds, waiting for that opportunity to jump and grab whatever the prey is. And that's how God is describing sin. Now, we're going to ask this more specifically later, but let's go ahead and ask it even now. What does that suggest to us about sin? I didn't change my little underneath piece. Sorry about that. That should be.
Well, by the statement God makes here, sin is on us.
Okay.
I mean, it don't just happen. We're part of it. I mean, it's not going to happen unless we allow it,
Okay.
participate in it.
Okay. So,
It's dangerous and deadly.
okay. I like all those. It takes action on our part, sometimes inaction, but there's a choice on our part. It's deadly, it's dangerous, but it's always lurking. There's a second part to that, and I hope that you've already noticed it, but we'll make sure that we do. Remember dominion was that word back in Genesis 1 when mankind was created? And we shall create man in our image, male and female, he created them, in the later passage, verse 28. And we shall give them dominion over all the earth and everything that creeps on the earth and every. That word dominion means what?
Control or power over.
Okay, rule, reign, dominance. That's where the word comes from, right? And yet, we brought this up in the garden. How did the serpent come to Eve?
Shrewdly, I forget the word, but.
Yeah.
You know,
He was more cunning than all of it,
yeah.
right? He came, well, I should have said Satan. Satan came as a serpent. And a serpent, as far as we know, now maybe we talked about this, maybe it did have legs before that because of the curse. But it crawls, it slithers. But where is it? On the earth. So, in that moment, did Satan have any dominion?
Not really.
No. He had absolutely no power over Adam, over Eve, or anything. He had to convince them to do what?
To go against God.
Yeah. So he had to convince them basically to give it up. Look at what the Lord is saying here to Cain, because it's the same idea. Matter of fact, it's more plain here. He says, again, sin lies at the door and its desire is for you, but you should what? You should ignore it. Well, that might be advantageous, but is that what he said? You should rule over it. Now, I don't think that's by example. He didn't say you should be victorious over it. That wouldn't work. He didn't say you should rise above it. That would work. He said, ignore it, don't give it a place. That would work. But he uses the word rule. Reign. You should rule over it. What's going to happen instead? Cain's going to be ruled by it. And here's the danger of sin. So when we go back to the question of what is sin that we started off with, in this passage, especially in verse 7, what is it? It's missing the mark. It's violating God. It's breaking that relationship. It is something that is trying to steal what from us?
Our power, our control, our dominion.
Yeah. Now watch this. If you want to put a marker in your Bible, or if you just want to put your hand there, we won't be there long. I want you to go to that passage, Romans chapter 6. I think we know it pretty well because we quote it a lot. And for good measure, we do. Romans chapter 6. We've already talked about the idea that God said that in the day that you eat of this tree, you shall surely die. That sin brings death. That life is only ending up. That when we sever that relationship with God, we have nothing but death. Because life is only found in God. And this is the true danger of sin that we're seeing again. But we're going to tie these pieces back together, not by my magical mind or something like that, but by what Paul is going to tell us, what the Spirit tells us. So you remember how this chapter starts. He says, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Certainly not. How long shall we, how shall we who died to sin live any longer in it? Okay? And then he's going to say in verse 3, or do you not know that as many of us as were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Therefore we were buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. And it ties back to earlier lessons, the idea that life is only in God. Okay? But if we keep reading, he says, for if we have been united together in the likeness of his death, certainly we also should be in the likeness of his resurrection, knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him, that the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be, what's that next word? Slaves of sin. And if we keep reading, for he who has died has been freed from sin. What was God challenging Cain in that moment with? By saying you should rule over it. What was he warning him? What was he sharing with him? You're going to give yourself over to it. It's going to rule. We can go to some other passages. We're just going to go further down in chapter 6 here in just a moment. But once we give ourselves over to sin, it's not just like we've got this mark on our account. We transition from this idea of being in the image of God, we're still in the image of God, but this placement that we are created with dominion and the purpose and all that came with that, and we took it and put it underneath, not God's dominion, though ultimately everything is, but now the dominion of sin and death. And that's where Satan's playground is. And that's where he's trying to keep us. So if we keep reading in chapter 6, what does he say? Now if we died with, this is verse 8, now if we died with Christ, we believe that we also live with him, knowing that Christ, having been raised from the dead, dies no more. Death no longer has, what's the word? Dominion over him. Who had dominion in the garden? God did. Then who had it below him, if you would?
Man, didn't Adam did.
Yeah, that's it. What's come between them? This dominion of sin and death. What has God done through his Son? Taking it out of the way. Freed us from that. All right, I want you to read just a couple more verses and we'll go back to our story. All right, so verse 11 then, he challenges us. I'm sorry, verse 10, I don't want to leave that out. For the death that he died to sin once for all. For the life that he lives to God. So 11 challenges us. Likewise, so this is what's happened here. This is what he did. Likewise, what do we need to do? You also reckon yourselves to be dead indeed to sin, but alive to Christ Jesus our Lord. Therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal bodies, that you should obey it in its lust. Verse 14. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you're not under law, but under grace. That brings another element I know. Just look at the words. This idea that he should reign over sin, but instead he's going to allow sin to reign over him. Now, again, this is deadly. It's dangerous. All sin can do is abide in death. Now, this would take us into other studies and go back into Romans chapter 5. We don't have time to do that tonight. Let's go back to our story, back in Genesis 4. I don't want to belabor the point, but I want to make sure that we spend at least some time thinking about, and my brain's a little bit used up from today too, so if you feel that way too, I apologize, but I'm right with you, okay? If you do well, what's the other side of that? And not will you be righteous, not will you be holy, not will you be whatever the term is that we want to use there, but what did the Lord say? Right after that. If you do well,
You're accepted.
will you not be accepted? Again, I don't want to belabor the point. I just want to make sure we connect with it and we get it. God is about relationship. He wants us to be accepted. He wants us to be a part. What does it take? What did Cain need to do in this moment? He already missed the mark on the sacrifice. Did God say you're condemned to hell and you have no way back and you have no opportunity to redeem or whatever? Is that what he told him? No, he said, you're at a critical moment, Cain. You're going to either reign over this sin or it's going to reign over you. Instead, what you need to do is do what's right. It's not just an arbitrary thing. The commandments of God aren't just arbitrary. He didn't just pull them out of the air and say, hey, try to keep this one, try to keep that one. I'll see if I'll test you and see if you can juggle this one. I'm not saying there aren't some tests involved in some places, but generally speaking, a law is a representation of what? So if we pull it out of the terms of God, and we talk about nations, countries, kingdoms, laws are a representation of what?
Commands.
Commands, okay. But what do those commands represent? Obviously, we have different laws here than they do in Saudi Arabia. Is that fair? Do you all understand that? Okay? Good, bad, otherwise, we're not making that argument right now, but if you were to get caught stealing here, It may not be fun. You may have to do some time in jail. You get caught stealing there, you lose a hand. Those are different laws with different penalties. Do you follow me? You can do pretty much still whatever you want to religiously. There, you can't. What do laws represent?
The form of government that you're under.
Okay. What does a form of government represent? Yeah, okay. But what does it represent? I want you to think a little bit beyond that. Somebody wrote those laws. They came from somewhere.
Right and wrong.
Beliefs.
There you go. The beliefs, right? Where do our laws supposedly originate? We talk about the founders, don't we? And we talk about what they believed. And we talk about the Constitution in which they codified that. And then we have, right? So we'll talk about, in politics, we'll talk about original intent. You've heard that term, right? That's when people are trying to go back to the framers and say, what did they intend when they wrote that? And they're trying to honor that. But law is a representation of the ones who are giving it. So whoever wrote that law in Saudi Arabia, that was their belief system. They codified it and said, you've got to keep this. Do you follow me? In dynastic China, depending on who the emperor was, that was the law. Whatever he believed that he wanted, there was a she too, at least one, they wanted you to do, that was the law. It was a representation of who, though? The lawgiver. Do you follow me that far? Okay. Who's the lawgiver? God. And if you follow that, the first law he gave was not to partake of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what was he extending about himself in that? The idea of free choice, the idea of right and wrong, and the idea of what? Relationship. Ultimately, we all have relationships in our life. We're in different places. Some of you all maybe have grandkids. I have kids. And then Miss Eva back there is not quite to that part of her life yet. I mean, we're all in different places in our life, and that's just part of this world. But we all, this affects all of us. What does sin do? What did it do to Adam and Eve? As soon as they realized that sin, what happened to them? They ran and hid. What did it do to the relationship? It severed it, pushed it away. What is this sin portrayed as? Something that is going to rule and put us in servitude rather than our natural form of dominion. So let's ask the question again. What is sin? Based on a few things we're talking about tonight, sin is an enslaver. Now, I'm going to use the Paul passage from Romans, but also the allusion there that the Lord makes in Genesis 4. What's sin's desire?
Separate.
Okay. You remember what he said? How he said it? I like Eugene's answer to separate. That's ultimately what it is, right? Sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you. It wants to consume you. The example of Adam and Eve, the example of so many. What happens when someone gets wrapped up in sin? How quickly does it change a person? The person that is called a man after God's own heart in Scripture. Who is it? David. This is a young man, who's out in the shepherd field by himself with a shepherd's hook and a staff. And obviously he became somewhere along the line pretty proficient with a sling. And we talked about this when we talked about David a couple Sunday mornings ago. And when he even shows up at Saul and he's talking about taking on Goliath, he goes back to those days and says he had fought off what? A bear and a lion. Now, I don't know about you, and I don't think I could fight off a bear and a lion. I mean, I would try if it was attacking my family, but that's a big deal, no doubt. But that showed his faith, right? And then he goes up to Saul, and where nobody else could or would or desired to or whatever to fight this, David's like, hey, I've got this. God's got this. Just let me have him. And he goes out there and he takes a stone and places it right between that giant's eyes. And when he gets up to him, he takes his sword, his own sword, Goliath's sword, and cuts his head off. I mean, this is who we're talking about. He goes and he fights the Ammonites, he fights the Amorites, he defeats them. He fights the Philistines, he defeats them. He runs from Saul all that time, he was faithful to God. And yet, when he defeats all of his enemies, and there's peace in the kingdom, he finds himself up on the Palisades, looking down and sees Bathsheba bathing. And how quickly does that man change? Let's make no mistake in understanding that sin is not interested in just showing someone a good time or finding some joy in life. It is there to consume. Look at what David became. Not only did he commit adultery, which was bad enough, and it's worse than you think. And you probably think it's pretty bad. Do you know who Bathsheba was? Uriah. You remember who Uriah was? He was a Hittite that had joined up with David. It was one of his mighty men. It was one that went to behind the Philistine lines because David yearned after water from a well, and they overheard him, so they went and risked their lives to get him a cup of water. It's worse than that. One of his chief advisors was Bathsheba's father. And what did he do? He not only committed sin, he tried to run from it. We heard something about that before? He tried to hide it. He tried to cover it. Did we hear something about that? What did Adam and Eve try to do? They tried to hide. To the point that what did he do? He committed murder. What did Cain do? This is the product and the reality of sin. Now, is every sin that someone commits going to lead them to murder? No, but it leads us into that mindset of death. Because that's all it can do is consume. And that's why it's so dangerous, and that's why it needs to be Saul. It's an active threat. I think we need to see that too. It's not some kind of passive thing. God described it as lying in wait, ready to what? Ready to pounce. Ready to snare us. Ready to get us. Sin is destruction of relationship. It's destruction of relationship with God, relationship with our neighbor, our fellow man, and our relationship even with ourselves. And I say that because anytime, and we've seen this in our own life. We can take David because it's such a prominent figure and go through that with his life, but you know, and I know, when we have found ourselves doing things that we're not supposed to be doing, it leads us on a path that we don't want to be on. I don't know who to give credit to, it's not new to me, you've probably heard it yourself, that sin will take you further than you ever want to go. It will cost you more than you ever intended to pay, and it will keep you there longer than you ever wanted to stay. And it's just true. Let's end with this, and we'll work this into our invitation. No other song leaders came in, Jimmy, so I might have to pick out one.
31.
It'll be 31. What about God?
I like this passage from James chapter 4. It says, there is one lawgiver who is able to save and destroy. And that's kind of a scary passage to me, that God is our lawgiver.
Yeah.
You go in two directions sometimes.
Yeah, it is. There's a lot of things like that are scary. But I would go back to, and let's use that, Alan, as we look at this. But what about God? He's that lawgiver. He can save or he can destroy. What happened with Cain? Try to warn him. Cain does what he wants. Then what does God do?
I think God still shows a little compassion and still protects them.
Yeah. So God is shown to be one who tries to warn, but ultimately He allows for choices to be made. He is not going to take away our ability to choose. He didn't take it away from Adam and Eve. He didn't take it from Cain. He didn't take it from Abraham. He didn't take it from the people in Noah's day. He doesn't take it away. That's something I struggle with. And there's some things that I think that I've dealt with in my life trying to deal with that concept, because it is easy to say, well, if God just wouldn't allow that to happen, but the reality is, what is it without choice? What's a relationship without, if you didn't choose it? Is it even meaningful? So you end up on some very philosophical things. But God also shows that sin must be judged. It can't be allowed to continue, because what does it bring? Sin and death. By the way, that's what we're going to see. So as we move from this first family into the first part of civilization, that's what we're going to see. We're going to see mankind rebel against God and make that choice and follow that choice all the way to the point where God says, there's no good left. I'll take a second to know. But God also shows He is a bestower of mercy and hope. What did He end up doing to Cain?
Show us some mercy.
Yeah. Did He take the judgment away? No, but He limited the judgment, and then He protected Cain. And you think, why would He do that? But on the other hand, we need to be thankful He did. You say, why? Because you and I need that protection too. We're not free from this idea of sin. Yeah, we might not have killed someone, I hope. But our sins are just as crimson as theirs, and we need His mercy too. So what does He do? He says, He puts protection on him and says no one can harm him, and puts a threat on anybody that would. There are going to be consequences. David had consequences even after he was forgiven. You understand that, right? So David was forgiven. Nathan comes to him, tells him that story about this family has this one little ewe lamb, right? And takes it in like it's a pet part of the family. And then this rich neighbor takes that lamb away and slaughters it to feed some neighbors. And he's like, oh, I'm going to take and kill that man. And Nathan says, you are that man. And he repents, and you have this beautiful psalm in which he repents and he laments what ended up happening.
His son dies.
4 sons died. The first son from that adulterous relationship, and then 3 more as part of the punishment, the judgment of his sins. Now God had spared him, though, because what was the punishment under the law for adultery? What was the punishment under the law for murder? I say He spared him. I don't know. Maybe I'd rather, I think I probably would, rather have lost my life than have to go through dealing with losing 4 of my sons' lives. But the idea that He put protection on him is undeniable. Well, why does all this matter? This happened so long ago. It's the same story still today. We sin, we go after it, we long for it, we desire whatever it is. It tricks us. It does not give us what we thought we were going to get. It enslaves us. It leads us down a path where we're doing things we are ashamed of. Do you think at the end of this, Cain was like, you know what, I'm pretty proud of killing my brother? And he walked around the rest of his life thinking what? Do you understand what the kind of weight that had to have been? Walk around the rest of your life, and they lived a long time back then. Walking around and saying, because I was jealous and didn't want to fix my relationship with God, I killed my brother. Sin is not our friend. God tries to warn us, but He ultimately allows us to choose. But He doesn't end there. He tries to intervene. In the book of Romans that we saw, we talked about Jesus and being buried with Him. He provides us a way. 1 Corinthians 15, actually put this up on the Facebook today. Paul, writing to that church at Corinth, says, "Moreover, brethren, I declare to you, first of all, that which I also received, that which I preached to you, and that which you stand, the gospel. For I delivered to you, first of all, that Jesus Christ died according to the Scriptures, was buried, and rose again the third day according to the Scriptures." And if we kept reading, we go on and say that he was seen by the 12, he was seen by Peter, Cephas is called in that text, and by 500 at one time. And the whole point of what Paul is saying is, God did something. He didn't leave us there. And Jesus went to a cross to die to bring us hope. And tonight, I hope that can be an encouragement to us. And I know that as I look across, we're probably all aware of that sacrifice. But tonight, as we extend an invitation, maybe there's someone who needs prayers, or maybe there is someone that needs to talk about obeying the gospel tonight. But even if you don't need to do that first part, we need to think about our sin in our life and make sure that it's not ruling over us. If there's something apart that we need to bring before God, we need to make sure that we do that. And if we can be of help in that, that's what we're here for. So let's stand together as we sing a song.